Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Odin. One of Donald Trump's central promises as president has been to mass deport millions of immigrants at quote-unquote light speed. And we've already seen him do several things to try to achieve this goal. So he's tried to fast-track deportations, and he has boosted raids by the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, across the country. He's also removed temporary protected status for certain groups, like for immigrants from Haiti and from Venezuela, and he's even sent some deportees to Guantanamo Bay. On this episode of the podcast, to discuss these attacks, my comrade Samuel Karlin interviews immigrant rights organizer and writer Silky Shah. Silky is the executive director of Detention Watch Network, which is a national coalition of organizations that oppose immigrant detention. And she's also the author of the book Unbuild Walls. This is a really informative interview that really gets to the heart of the buildup of this war on immigration that's been happening for the last few decades. Silky and Sam discuss the root causes behind migration, like violence, climate catastrophe, US-backed wars, and they also talk about why the immigrant rights movement sometimes actually shies away from discussing this, bigger, more global context. They also discuss the prevailing narrative that we've all heard time and time again of the good and bad immigrant, this idea that there are some people who deserve to be deported and other people who deserve to stay. This is a position, of course, that politicians from both sides of the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, subscribe to, and as Silky points out, it is a way to separate and weaken our communities. Most importantly, Silky explains how we resist the attacks on immigrants. To beat Donald Trump, to protect our migrant siblings, we need to unite our struggles and work across movements and countries. We need to fight together as workers and as oppressed people, and we need to fight US militarism and deportations. And we need to do so with an international perspective. If you want to support Left Voice, you can do so at patreon.com/leftvoice. Follow us on social media, where we use the handle @left_voice. In the show notes, I'll of course link to Silky's work and to related work on this important topic. Here is Samuel Karlin's interview with Silky Shah.
I'm joined now by Silky Shah, Executive Director of Detention Watch Network and author of Unbuild Walls, available at Haymarket Books. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Sam. It's great to be here with you.
Absolutely. And we're going to be getting into, in depth, the various attacks that we're seeing on immigration currently, as well as your analysis that you've developed of how this has really built up over the years, over administrations, intertwined deeply with the carceral system. That said, I did want to sort of frame the start of this conversation a bit differently, since so many of these attacks are dependent on this idea that we're seeing an invasion at the border, or we're seeing violent crime and whatever other fear-mongering we hear. I was hoping, as someone who has organized for well over a decade for immigrant justice, if you could touch a little bit on why do people migrate? Like, why these attacks wouldn't exist if we didn't actually see immigration, and how can people understand why actually immigration does happen?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I think that there is this perception, especially because of the narratives around public safety and national security, that the reason people are migrating are for nefarious reasons, which is totally absurd. And it's a lie that we're constantly told, that immigration is a public safety issue or immigration is a national security issue, when that's just not true at all. In fact, the main reason people are migrating are often because of family relationships. So reunification with family that is here in the US. And also, of course, probably the most major reason, for labor, for opportunity, for, that's the reason that my parents came, my father came, for seeking education and then ended up staying and getting a job here and then eventually sponsored a lot of our family members to come. So again, like bringing family and connecting family. And then the sort of narrative we hear so much now is about people seeking refuge and the context in which we talk about people seeking refuge or people seeking asylum is is a complicated one and one that, often because the US has a hard time, people in the US have a hard time sort of understanding what's happening globally. There isn't as much context for the reasons people might be coming, which the US is sort of directly involved in, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, but because of globalization, because of climate catastrophe, because of violent conditions in other parts of the world, and especially in places like Central America, which the U.S. had a role in terms of sort of U.S. U.S. backed wars in those regions, especially in the 80s. And so just seeing sort of the disruption that's happened because of U.S. involvement, because of things like the North American Free Trade Agreement and economic agreements. There's a lot of devastation that's happened in communities in Mexico and Central America and then beyond because of the conditions that we're in. And so people are also genuinely fleeing and seeking refuge. And so I think those are all the different contexts in which people are coming. There is, I think in a lot of ways the immigrant rights movement has shied away from talking about some of those root causes, but I think it's so essential that we tell a sort of bigger global story when we're talking about what's happening with immigration.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you bringing all those different reasons that people migrate, getting to, I think, the main conversation that people are having now. I mean, we are 1 month at the time of this recording, a little over 1 month into the return of Trump to the presidency. And I'm interested in how you would sort of characterize some of the attacks that we're seeing from him, some of the anti-immigrant agenda that he and other right-wing figures, but I would say also people in the Democratic Party are putting forward. How does this in some ways build off of or maybe diverge or compare and contrast to what we saw under the first Trump presidency?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest challenges right now is that actually, for so many years under the Obama administration, we had been fighting mass deportations and fighting the expansion of the immigrant detention system. Um, and the narrative during that period of time was very much there are a set of immigrants who are deserving, who are good, who are productive and aren't doing anything wrong and who are relatively innocent. And then there's a set of the problem, like the way Obama positioned it and his administration position is that there's a set of immigrants who are undeserving and who have had contact with the criminal legal system and therefore we should deport them. And that was the narrative. So it was very much a good versus bad immigrant narrative. And it made it hard for us to make the case often around some of the policies that the Obama administration was putting in place, like secure communities, which tied ICE police or local county jails more closely with ICE. And so what happened when Trump came in 2017 is actually it gave us room to do a couple things. One is to really break from the good versus bad immigrant narrative. It was a sort of more even playing field where actually a lot of Dems were open to sort of more progressive policies, especially at the state and local level, to say, actually, no, we don't want ICE to engage at all with local police, and we don't want immigration detention centers here or other things like that. The other thing we were able to do is that the Democrats had often seen a lot of money and resources going to ICE or ICE detention as a way to create better conditions for immigrants. You know, we always talk about how abysmal the conditions in immigrant detention centers are. And so they're like, well, if we give them more money, this can be a nicer place for people to be while they go through their proceeding. And we were able to sort of challenge that and say, no, actually, you give more money to ICE. They're not going to make better conditions. They're just going to grow the detention system. They're going to add more agents, which means more people will be caught up in the system. And the narrative that the Trump administration at the time was putting out was like, well, we just want money for a wall. But then underneath it was more agents, more beds. And so we were able to say, no, like you don't want this wall, but you also shouldn't want these other things either. And so I think that was a sort of remarkable time to kind of shift the way people thought about these things. It was the emergence of the abolish ICE framework and people really sort of understanding the harms of ICE as this entity in and of itself. And that's not to say that things were great prior to ICE's existence, but more just to say that here's this agency that exists just to arrest and detain and deport immigrants. Like let's actually move away from that. What's so challenging now is that the Democrats, and I think the beginning of 2025 was it was so hard to see how much the Democrats had moved to the right. And it happened, it's been happening over the last couple of years, and especially through the campaign that Kamala Harris ran for president, where we just saw Democrats trying to be more hardline to some degree than Trump on the issue in order to garner more votes. And Trump winning kind of signaled to a lot of Democrats that don't actually have a lot of vision around the issue that their way of kind of staying relevant was to move to the right on immigration. And so you saw a bunch of Democrats caving on the Lake and Riley Act, which is this really harmful piece of legislation. Um, and it really reinforced this idea that, like, for so long, the Democrats at least were making some argument that immigration was good, but there has been an abandonment of a pro-immigrant vision from the Democrats. And I think that's what's so challenging about this time is that it's very different than 2017. In 2017, there was a lot of like they weren't there right away, but there was some room for us to move them. And I think right now that sort of opening to move them is tougher and it's going to take more time. There's a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. No, it's been really upsetting to watch. You actually talked about sort of the next thing I wanted to touch on, but feel free to go deeper in, is that, yeah, the first piece of anti-immigrant legislation that we are seeing passed under Trump, but certainly a bipartisan effort, is the Lake and Riley Act. And I don't want to get ahead of your analysis of it, but certainly I think it's an example of the way in which even just there's this idea that exposing more immigrants to detention or to the carceral system or policing or whatever just paves the way for all sorts of horrific developments. I'm interested in your analysis of what the Lake and Riley Act could mean moving forward, perhaps what legislation it's already building on top of, and just what you make of its passage. Well, I think it hasn't been signed by Trump.
It was signed by Trump. It was the first piece of legislation signed. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a tough couple months into 2025. So, I mean, just in terms of my bigger picture analysis, understanding the way that the US became the world's leading incarcerator, having the highest, like the largest prison system in the world, and then eventually the largest immigration detention system in the world, there is a history of that that's really tied to moral panics around crime. And I think, in the 80s, there was this particular story about a man named William Horton who was on a furlough, which is something that used to happen. People would be in a prison sentence, but would be able to like leave to reacclimate to society. It was like a really good program. It was a really good way to kind of support people who are trying to sort of transition out of being in prison and um, you know, like committed a crime in those conditions, and then it became this story that sort of blew up and became the story that defined the 1988 election. And the thing that happened during that period of time is that Democrats started to learn that being tough on crime was actually good for winning elections. And so then you see from that point where already there's so much harsh legislation being passed in the 80s and the war on drugs is happening. And then you see in the 90s, you go from the US having 1 million people in prison to 2 million people in prison over the course of a decade, like unbelievable growth to happen. And I think in many ways, that's how I feel about this moment where you take this really, Laken Riley was this young woman in Georgia who was killed by somebody who's Venezuelan and who is a migrant and had been out on parole or And I think the and had previously been had committed a theft crime, so I think there was this sort of narrative around this where, okay, here's this awful story. I mean, it's a pretty close and shut case. Like it was like this is not common. It's quite rare. And here's this really horrible tragedy, but we're gonna then take this really horrible tragedy and say, here's this one instance of something that happened, and we're gonna apply these theories to whole huge categories of people. So anybody who has committed theft, oh, therefore, who knows where that could go? Who knows what that could mean in terms of what they might do next? And so then this becomes this narrative of like, well, we have to mandatorily detain them. We have to mandatorily deport them without any sort of due process, without any sort of conversation with the judge. Like it just becomes like, again, a moral panic. And the way moral panics work, and this is actually how Trump started his presidential run back in 2015, when there was also this story about this woman, Kate Steinle, in San Francisco, who had been shot by a stray bullet. And again, there was this undocumented immigrant involved, and therefore the story blew up. And there was a Kate Steinle Act at some point that didn't pass Congress, but the reality was is that you saw this sort of way that politicians, and you've seen it time and time again, use these moral panics to sort of like gain legitimacy and sort of extend state control. And so that's what we saw with the late 80s, where moral panics were kind of like really present, and we saw the growth of the prison system. You might remember hearing stories about Hillary Clinton in the 90s talking about quote unquote super predators, like that kind of thing. And then now you're also seeing a similar thing where the Lake and Riley story, such a tragic story, is now being used for political gain by not just Republicans, but also by Democrats. And we are in this place where I think there's a real question of what that means. And going to your question, does this mean we get to a place where the detention system triples, which is what they're proposing right now, because of these conditions? And I think we're trying to do everything we can to stop it, but that is what it's signaling in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this has been a theme throughout. You've written in depth on this, but I do think this idea of good immigrant, a bad immigrant is so central. I'll just say anecdotally, I'm seeing any article about immigration, you have right wingers who will comment, Trump's not going after immigrants, he's going after criminals, right? This idea of separating the two. And so I'm interested, if you want to touch even more, you already have touched on it, but even more on how essential that sort of framing is, but also some of the ways we see it, maybe unintentionally, maybe well-intentioned, but that framing also being applied within immigrant justice spaces.
Yeah, no, and I really do think that it's by design to separate communities. I think it's very intentional what they're trying to do. And the thing about the narrative in the immigrant rights movement for so long has been centered around this framework of comprehensive immigration reform, which it's not really people still bring it up, but it's not really possible in Congress. But it was this idea to kind of get legalization for a large number of undocumented immigrants and then have a lot of trade-offs for more border militarization, more criminalization. And the way that that often played out was, again, kind of pushing immigrants as being sort of like the pinnacle of a human being, like so productive, so perfect, mostly innocent, mostly, like all these things. It was very in line with this like respectability politics. And often the narrative, became we are not criminals. And the thing about the US has a long history of racism and obviously a history of slavery. And when you look at the prison system in the US and you look at who is disproportionately targeted, it's Black, brown, indigenous, working class, and poor people. That's who it is. And so when you're saying we are not criminals, often the sort of, assumption, even if people aren't naming it, is, well, we're not those individuals who are Black or poor or, undeserving, we're people who are deserving because we're better than that. And so it separates people and it doesn't help us. And one of the things that happens in the immigrant rights movement a lot is, there's studies that show that immigrants, commit less crimes, quote unquote, immigrants commit less crimes than US citizens. And people say this constantly without sort of realizing that they're one, continuing to make the connection between immigration and public safety, which again, as I said earlier, is a lie. And two, there's like underlying that sort of narrative is anti-Black racism. And so I think that is a real challenge for us as a movement because yes, you want to point out the fact that ICE is rampantly targeting people and people who might not be a quote unquote priority. But at the same time, the way these systems work is to expand the scope of who can be considered criminal. So somebody who had a certain type of conviction, who might have been put out on parole and, maybe they had a sentence, maybe whatever, all the different things after 1996, they had no due process because of the ways the law changed. So the law changed to encompass more and more people. And the same thing happened with the criminal legal system, where you saw with the war on drugs and the shift in policy in the 80s and 90s is that more and more people were subject to longer sentences, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing laws. And the amount of time people would spend, the fact that they would not be able to get out on bail or bond. I mean, the jail system has, some 400,000 more people who are in jail not serving a sentence. They're there for pretrial detention. And so I think there is this assumption that any encounter with the criminal legal system means XYZ. And of course, there's very like sort of this very particular focus on violent crime, but I think it fails to recognize that a lot of these systems grew as we saw, you know, both like the destruction of the welfare state and the fact that more and more stratification was happening in society. And so you see the sort of like reduction of the middle class and the resources that people need, and people aren't getting what they need. And it's also the reason why it's so clear that immigrants are being scapegoated right now and the fear mongering is being effective. It's because people are really struggling and they're looking for somebody to blame. And the reality is that our elected leaders have failed us in every way, but instead immigrants have become the target.
Absolutely. And I'll try to not take up too much time, but just an example that's been on my mind is I'm sure you heard in Newark, we had a very high profile, really horrific ICE raid. It got national attention. And the response from people who totally support immigrants, who totally are against these attacks, the sort of response was, oh, look, not only did they go after immigrants, they even went after people who are citizens. They went after a veteran. And I think that implies, even if it's not intended, that it would have been less horrific if it wasn't also citizens and a veteran getting roped up into the raid.
I've actually brought up that story so many times, Sam. Like, it's like it's easy to fall back on that narrative, but the thing that we have to stay true to is like, no, this is violence being committed by the state, and it's not okay for anyone. It's not that it's not only okay for XYZ people. Like it actually, we have to kind of hold true that all of this violence is bad.
Yeah. And if anything, maybe you could make the case that like, oh, clearly this buildup of the carceral state is just going to harm everyone. But
right.
Obviously,
exactly.
there's a tricky question of how do you do that in a way that unites rather than separates.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I think there's a lot of stories out there about how in places like New Jersey and Illinois that have been sort of phenomenal in the work that people have done there to pass sanctuary law and to protect immigrant communities. How it's actually not, like they're not able to target people in the way that they were hoping because there has been all these guardrails put up intentionally, and that's great. And so it shows us again that if you sort of block the carceral state from being engaging in this way with immigrant communities, like they can't do everything they want to do. It's the easiest way for ICE to bring people into the system. And why it was so effective in those Obama years is because that's where the Obama administration really pinned all their strategies on deportations, other than the border. But in the interior, they really focused on the criminal legal system and saw that as a way to do this effectively. And it worked. I mean, so many people were funneled into the system. So actually, sort of learning about how, like, I think a lot of immigrant communities and activists and organizers and lawyers were forced to learn about how the criminal legal system was operating in the Obama years, and also because of Black Lives Matter and other things that were happening during that time, it gave us more tools to say, hey, this is a way we can throw a wrench and we can stop this from happening. But I think the challenge is again, we're in a rightward moment on immigration, but we're also in a rightward moment when it comes to general crime panics and sort of like the post BLM era. And that's also a challenge because I think that work was so integral to actually also helping immigrants as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but I think it was the CEO of CoreCivic, the private prison company, which said something along the lines of New Jersey's passage of ban on private prison ICE contracts, called it like a dagger at the heart of our ability to conduct operations. Or someone needs to fact check the details of that quote, but it was something that certainly everyone on the side of
I think
maintaining ICE detention saw as a real detriment to their ability to conduct raids.
totally. And it wasn't even, I feel like I need to fact check this too, but I think there was also like a official in the Biden administration or somebody who was basically like, this would be like if the private prison legislation were to stay in New Jersey, that it would be a catastrophe, quote unquote, for ICE. Like, which is remarkable. I mean, again, we were as a movement doing such a great job of stopping them. And I think those things are holding in a lot of ways, but I think the question is, um, how are they going to evolve and how is the state going to respond given how successful we've been in some ways?
Yeah, no, there's definitely a legal battle playing out, at least in New Jersey right now. But
Absolutely.
I have a tendency to make every conversation just about New Jersey. So I should probably stop myself and bring it back to the larger, analysis. And one thing, we've talked a lot about sort of the internal apparatus for detention. I want to talk, you touched on also the increasing militarization of the border, which is not separate, right? It's so deeply connected, but I think certainly the way we've seen border states, Texas, I believe you're in Arizona, and I
No,
forget if it was you or
I'm from Texas. I was born and raised in Texas, but I live in Washington State, which is I live actually 30 minutes from the border, but the northern
okay.
border.
Yeah. Well, I forget. It was someone, I think, in Arizona. It might have been you, but called Arizona like a laboratory of anti-immigrant policy or something. So I'm interested in the role that these border states and the militarization of the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, to clarify, is also playing in the development of these repressive systems.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good question. And what was sort of remarkable about those years under Obama is that, Arizona became this really incredible site of organizing and resistance to what was happening both by Obama and by conservative actors in places like Arizona, like Joe Arpaio was sheriff of Maricopa County. The governor and other people, like they passed SB 1070, which was this bill that was sort of dubbed the Show Me Your Papers law, that was really pushing, sort of eventually ruled unconstitutionally, this sort of question of if states have the right to engage in immigration enforcement in a particular way. And I think that what is happening now is that we're seeing, there in some ways SB 1070 stood, in some ways it didn't. But it also, there's a lot of organizing to get the Obama administration to intervene. Unfortunately, in Texas, where Governor Greg Abbott, who has really been a major player on immigration and kind of sometimes flies under the radar. I think there's so much attention on Trump, so much attention on Stephen Miller, but I think Greg Abbott, both through the busing scheme, which I imagine a lot of people know about, um, where immigrants were bused to Chicago and New York and other sanctuary cities to quote unquote bring the border to those cities and sort of exacerbated the social safety nets there and created those conditions where there were divisions in community and actually a lot moved to the right. But also, Governor Greg Abbott implemented Operation Lone Star, and the state legislature passed SB 4. There's a couple SB 4s, but anyways, these these shifts in policy are meant to really like kind of harness the state legal, like criminal legal system to target immigrants and find, there were disaster declarations and other declarations to make certain misdemeanors even more severe, to, use state prisons for immigration detention, to, in counties where people were being targeted when they would like basically bond out to get out and then eventually be deported. That forfeited bond money would go to the county. There was, you know, law enforcement from across the state and even in the region that would come out to the border because of the quote unquote invasion language and approach. And so there was just all these different ways they were using law enforcement and the criminal legal system and the state troopers and all these different entities to put that energy on focusing on immigrants and changing the law. And you see in a lot of different states, in Florida, in Louisiana, in Iowa, and other places where there's just a lot of, hey, we have this federal immigration system and federal actors playing a role, even though they work really closely with local state law enforcement. But now they're adding this other layer of how do we criminalize people? And it becomes these sort of layers of punishment for immigrants because they go through this proceeding, but then they might end up in ICE detention and then they're deported. And there's just a lot of different layers. And so I think, we're doing a lot of work with groups in those quote unquote red states to try to block some of these pieces and pay attention here. And I think the challenge has been is for those many years, for those several years that Biden was in office, they really failed to intervene. And so I think that's what's, again, really hard about the Democrats right now is they're not doing the things that they need to do to really push back against the way these conservative governors and states have kind of taken hold of these policies.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think it was New York Times or Wall Street Journal. One of the major papers reported that Abbott is sort of Operation Lone Star has become a model for Homan and Trump. So definitely I appreciate you emphasizing the role that he's played. I think one more sort of layer to this whole system that is worth talking about is the role and I guess expansion of private prisons, private immigrant detention. So I'm interested, one, in the role that they play, but also in criticizing, rightfully so, these companies that profit off of destroying people's lives. How can we also avoid illusions that this would be okay so long as it was the government doing detention instead of just private companies?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about private prisons is that they came around in the period of time that neoliberalism was growing. So it was this moment when during the Reagan era, they really saw actually this like small government mindset. And so it was an opportunity for these sort of predatory companies. At the time, Corrections Corporation of America, which was the first one to kind of really come into play and started having facilities in Texas, to really say, okay, we're gonna use these private entities. And it's really how the state and capital work together. So I think in some ways, a lot of the narrative becomes, oh, look at these private prison companies and how evil they are, which they are, sure, they're terrible. And like a lot of organizers over the years I've talked to are like, well, they're our target. Let's go after them and let's do XYZ. And it's like, well, they're not the target. They're actually the opposition. Like they, in understanding how we develop strategy. And the reality is that they would be nothing if the state weren't willing to work with them, if the government wasn't willing to work with them. And I think that the thing about ICE and, INS previously, like this is where CoreCivic now, which is what Corrections and Corporation of America used to be, and Geo Group, which used to be Wackenhut, again, both of them, their first facilities, which still exist today, the Houston Processing Center and the Aurora Detention Center in Colorado, are like their first facilities. And like immigration enforcement and immigration detention has always been their sort of one of their like central um, things that they do. And so I think, Geo Group, for instance, I think some people have called it like an immigration enforcement conglomerate because they just like adapt to the different ways that um, the federal government wants to do this work. And so I remember a lot during the Obama administration, a lot of what we saw was Obama shifting for years. There was like hundreds of county jails that were used across the country, which are really terrible conditions. Often they're meant for short-term stays, but people would be in them for months. Um, and not have any outdoor recreation, like really, really bad conditions. And so what the Obama administration did, because they were so focused on conditions, was to say, well, let's create nicer facilities. And so Geo Group was like, okay, we'll play ball. Whereas like you had all these varied actors at the local level, sheriffs who aren't going to necessarily shift their whole conditions to benefit ICE. And so I think so basically what we saw during that period of time was an expansion of the use of private prisons where you had like 50% of the facilities privately operated, but by the end of Obama, it was 70% of the facilities privately operated or 70% of the capacity privately operated. And so again, it shows you that it was all about these companies sort of working with the state. And often you see a revolving door between ICE and these companies as well, and so they know what ICE is looking for, and yeah, they're working in tandem. So again, I think privatization is a problem, but again, like so many county jails are used. County jails are some of the worst conditions that we have. Um, and I don't generally believe that if ICE had its own, there's 5 facilities of the, 100, 200 facilities that ICE uses now that are owned and operated by ICE, but a lot of those facilities are terrible and a lot of those services are outsourced as well. So in all of these contexts, I think we have to just look at who is making these decisions and why they're making the decisions they're making and not kind of confuse. Yes, there's lobbying. Yes, there's other things, but a lot of the thing that we've seen when there's been research on this, I think there's this idea of, here are these private prison companies giving local officials money or elected officials money and Congress and whatever. But most of the time, what we see is that the reason why congressional actors or members of Congress support private prisons is because they have a private prison in their area, and if the private prison goes away, then there's going to be a loss of jobs. Like so much of it is about the political economy, and that political economy is not just about privatization, it's about all these facilities because even in New Jersey in that fight or in places like Illinois, a lot of these counties were hesitant to move away from these contracts because they would lose federal revenue. And so I think that we just have to have that bigger picture story when we tell this. And that's not to deny that private prisons are terrible and it would be a good thing for them to go away. But I think ultimately any of these facilities are bad because they're imprisoning people in really horrible conditions, imprisoning people generally, as opposed to private prisons are worse somehow.
Absolutely. And I didn't realize, but I think it's interesting you mentioned that one of the first facilities was in Aurora because I've not been following too closely, but that's actually a city I've seen a bit in the news because there have been protests there recently. And sort of moving to wrap things up, I have a few more questions, but to wrap things up on a more optimistic note, hopefully, for all the bummer things going on that we've talked about, we are seeing, certainly it's not the level of activity that we saw in large part empowered by the Black Lives Matter struggle, the demand for abolish ICE, but we are seeing already there's these protests happening all over the country, some really massive displays in certain areas. And so I'm interested in terms of what you're seeing, what you're thinking in terms of potential for resistance in the face of this, quite frankly, I would call it war on immigration.
Yeah, I mean, I think that It's been really heartening and incredible to see those protests that you're naming and see the way people are showing up. I think there's also a lot of behind the scenes work that people don't see where there's just a lot of work happening locally. There for many years we didn't have this scale of interior mass deportations that we saw under especially Obama and early Trump, where, people were rampantly being targeted and people were being funneled in through the criminal legal system. Like now that's starting to ramp up a little bit more, but a lot of that infrastructure that we had, like hotlines or bond funds or other things and resources that we need to sort of support people who are being caught up in the system are, have been dormant. And so there's this kind of like a lot of work that's being done to sort of bring back those hotlines, to bring back those bond funds, to do that work to make sure that people have the resources that they need. I think that there's also a lot of work being done in places. Again, you have sanctuary policy that's already in place. There's a lot of attacks on it. So really preventing things like the No Bailout for Sanctuary Cities Act, or I can't remember the exact name, but the bill in Congress right now that's moving, I think trying to prevent that where potentially states and cities could lose some federal funding. And so trying to make sure that there aren't attacks on sanctuary, but also trying to expand. I mean, one of the bills that's moving in a few different places is trying to stop transfers from prisons and jails to ICE detention, because so much of what we're seeing is people who have been out of community maybe for a period of time, but then being transferred to ICE detention, trying to sort of add ways to prevent the carceral system from interacting with ICE, often in unconstitutional ways, but still sort of happens. And so I think all these different strategies of preventing those sort of interactions is so important. And then the other thing is like they are going to do everything they can to expand the detention system. What we've seen over the years is incredible fights, not just to end contracts like we saw in New Jersey, but also to prevent expansion in the Midwest, for instance. I mean, they tried to expand at 10 or so different sites for new detention centers. And at every single location, people were like, no, we don't want this. And we're going to find ways to stop it. And so I think we're also starting to really gear up to be ready for some of those fights. I know that things like the use of Guantanamo for immigrant detention, and the return of family detention and other things have been sort of in the news. But I think some of that stuff is going to be like the ongoing fight that we're in for the next couple years.
Absolutely. Yeah. Even where I'm at, I know that ICE has said like they're looking to Newark to be a place where they build more detention centers after we banned them. And certainly I know people are gearing up for that fight as well. So just to your point, there's going to be a lot of struggles ahead. I personally am maybe more optimistic than a lot of people. Maybe that's naive, but I do think there's a lot of ways, as you point out, that people are fighting in the here and now. And just sort of as my last question, along with the immediate developments and struggle and resistance we're seeing, I do want to go maybe even further and kind of be maybe pie in the sky, but like think about your thoughts on what could it actually look like to not just win these fights immediately, but even build a world that actually like gets rid of detention, maybe opens borders, maybe organizes internationally, and stops keeping communities in struggle divided, but brings them together. How can we use what we're doing now and the fights that we're putting forward now to also have a larger vision of what that could look like and what an end to these repressive systems could look like?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think the dreaming and the vision is so, so essential right now. I do think that one of the biggest challenges is sort of the framework that's been offered for so long, that's actually like divided immigrant communities from other working class communities, other communities of color. Like we have to challenge that in every way. And I think the way that we do this right now is sort of do everything we can right now to protect our people, to prevent the expansion, to do all those things, but we also can't burn ourselves out because in 5 years, we might have opportunities that we don't have right now, and we have to build towards those. And building towards those is building bridges cross movement. And so a lot of what I write about and the intention of my work is to try to really have the immigrant rights movement see itself as a racial justice movement and be working in line with people who are fighting prison expansion and fighting discriminatory policing. I also think that, there's no way to divide, like, immigrant communities are a part of the labor community, are workers, and it's so essential that there aren't those divisions, and actually thinking about how we fight together and what's the way to kind of like break some of that. Again, this is the way the state operates and intentionally divides people, but how do we actually bridge there? And then I think, more broadly, that point that you're making about sort of like internationalism, like I think this last couple years, as we've witnessed what's happened in Gaza, there has been some opening to think about, I often think about the 80s, when actually the sanctuary movement during that period of time was an inherently internationalist movement, like really in communication with people in Central America and doing what people could to protect people and get them to the US and get them to Canada and places where that they were going to be safer. And I think right now starting to bridge and think about, especially after we're seeing what's happening in Panama and the third country deportations to places like Panama and Costa Rica and other places, like how do we start building those relationships? And so my hope is that some of the lessons we learn is to stop some of those divisions between movements, stop some of those silos, and think about some of that cross movement work. Because, like I said earlier, the reason they've succeeded is that immigrants are an easy scapegoat in this moment. But when we actually take a step back and think about, people are feeling economic insecurity, people are feeling that sort of scarcity mindset. But if we say, actually, no, it's the billionaires, it's all this money going to US militarism and detention and deportation, we need to divest and invest in the public good. And how do we do that together and for everyone?
Well, thank you so much for developing those ideas and providing your expertise. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Sam. It's really great to chat with you about this.
Absolutely.